So it took me a long time to come to belief. And one of the things that I came to admire as I hung out with Christians all around the country through politics was humility. Like I'd never seen this kind of humility. The political sphere is not filled primarily with humble people. It's quite the opposite. It's people who think they know, who think they can tell you, who think they should be running things. So in a lot of instances, it's the opposite of humility.
Welcome to the Dr. Jeff Show podcast, where I have the privilege every week of interviewing major thought leaders from many fields of influence, showing how our worldview changes everything. You can find the show everywhere podcasts are found, including Liftable, Edify, Apple, Spotify, you name it. If you like the show, would you consider leaving a review on your favorite platform? That helps more people find the show. On today's episode, I'm sharing a conversation I had with Mark Meckler at the National Religious Broadcasters Convention in Orlando, straight from our beautiful podcast suite. Mark is an American political activist, an attorney, and business executive. He currently serves as president of Citizens for Self-Governance and Convention of States Action. If you've ever wondered what a guy like this thinks about how citizens should be involved on everything that you can think of, and even issues like whether we should be preppers, well, let's listen into the conversation. Mark Meckler, welcome to the Dr. Jeff Show podcast.
It's great to be with you.
We've been friends for a long time, but here we are at the National Religious Broadcasters. We had a chance to meet up, and I'm so grateful for your taking time to be on the show.
Yeah, I'm really excited to be with you and to be at NRB this year. It's extraordinary.
Yeah, we do have the best space, wouldn't you agree?
I mean, with best the view, best space, best crew, I might add.
We do have the best
crew. You got it all.
This is a great month in our content calendar because we're talking about the nature of freedom. And as we're recording this, the Speaker of the House, McCarthy, and the President Joe Biden are going back and forth and debating and negotiating about a debt ceiling change. And a lot of Americans are hearing this message. You have to continue to increase government spending, otherwise the entire system's going to collapse. And one of the projects that you focus on is Citizens for Self-Governance. And you really drill down on a lot of the problems created by massive government spending. And that's what I want to spend time talking about on our show. Okay. Yeah. Because I really do think this is related to freedom. Do you feel that? Like, we can't be free if we are encumbered to trillions and trillions of dollars of debt that the future generations will have to pay.
Yeah, I agree with that. We can't be free. And it's also moral. I mean, even the founders said that passing debt from one generation to another is immoral. And for your viewers, I mean, just imagine you're getting near the end of your life. You think, you know, what I'm going to do is just rack up all my credit cards and all my debt because my kids and my grandkids will have to pay that off. And all of us would think that's just morally abhorrent. Like, we would be appalled that somebody would say that that's an okay thing to do. That's exactly what our government's doing, and we're supposed to be in control of our government. So I think it's a fundamental moral issue and a freedom issue.
For how many years has the United States federal government spent more than it's brought in?
It's been a very, very long time. There are very few periods in American history where the federal government doesn't spend more than it brings in. After the American Revolution, there was debt. They were spending more than they were bringing in during the American Revolution. So you have the very first government doing this. They were doing it in a state of emergency, though, and then they considered it a very serious moral obligation to pay it off afterwards. So I think there's then about a roughly 100-year period where the nation, generally speaking, is a creditor nation and not a debtor nation. But when you get into the New Deal and all of that stuff and continuing through in what they called the war on poverty, we've been a debtor nation for a very long time.
Yeah. When the United States goes into debt, and I'm covering some of the basics here because I don't want to assume that busy people watching or listening would have thought all of this through. So when we say the United States is in debt, who are we in debt to?
So there are multiple ways that debt is created in the United States. The primary way is the selling of bonds. So people have heard the term T-bill or treasury bonds. And so these are actually debt obligations of the United States. So they put those out there. They're borrowing the money from people who give them that money to buy those T-bills or those bonds. Someday those are coming due.
And it could be anybody in the world.
It could be you or I. Right. People privately buy those. Banks buy those.
It could theoretically be people from an enemy nation.
For example, China. China buys a lot of our debt, less lately, but China holds a lot of United States debt.
All right. So this is money that the United States federal government will have to pay at some point. But essentially now we just pay interest.
Yeah, we pay the interest on the debt. So it's like if you took out a mortgage, some mortgages, and I don't recommend this, are interest-only mortgages, which means all you're doing is paying the interest on the debt and the principal remains owing. So that's what we're paying on the debt. And there's one more part of borrowing that I want people to understand, because to me, it's the most insidious and dishonest way of borrowing. And that is that the federal government prints money. So this seems weird to people. What does it mean to print money? They literally just manufacture money. There's no value in that money. It's paper with numbers printed on it and pictures, right? When they print that money, it means they're putting more money in circulation. And that money is worth the same amount as the money that's currently in circulation. So think of it this way. If they print money, every time they print money, the dollar bill that's in your pocket is worth less. So that's a hidden tax. It's devaluing your money, and it's essentially borrowing money from future generations. That, by the way, is what creates the inflation we're suffering from now. When you print money, it devalues the money in your pocket. So this is the way the government does it. They don't tell you that they're taxing you, right? So that's why I say it's insidious. People need to understand when the government prints money, they're just taking money directly out of your pocket.
That answers one of the questions that I think a lot of people ask is, well, if we owe this money, but we owe it to ourselves and it's based on the full faith and credit of the United States, why don't we just print as much money as we want? But you don't have to take an economics class to realize that if you have $1 in your pocket and no additional value is added, but another dollar is added, then each dollar is now worth 50 cents, not $2.
Right. And eventually you get to a situation, folks might have heard of this. It's hyperinflation in the Weimar Republic in Germany. It got to the point where people literally had to go around with wheelbarrows full of cash to go to the grocery store. And that's what happens. You get inflation in the thousands of percent day in and day out. And eventually your money's just valueless. The currency collapses.
Yeah. So when the currency collapses, people still have their land. They still, if they are landowners, and a lot of people aren't,
right?
Or they don't really have anything that they can trade on to create additional value. If you have a car, maybe you can drive for Uber or something like. You can still make an income,
right?
But what is the impact of that of that hyperinflation on the lives of everyday people?
I mean, ultimately what it means is total societal collapse. I mean, that sounds calamitous and hyperbolic, but the reality is if you need to go to the grocery store and your money's not worth anything, you're not going to get groceries. That means you're going to have starvation. It means you can't pay your electric bill, and eventually they're going to shut off your electricity. It means you can't put fuel in your car, so you can't get to work, so you can't even earn a paycheck. So literally society just begins collapsing on itself.
It's basically like Zimbabwe or Venezuela.
Exactly.
Okay. And people do somehow manage to get by, but then it's all through the black market, which means that if you aren't willing to do illegal things, you can't survive.
Right. So you end up in a system, primarily a barter system is what ends up happening. So if you have a skill, hopefully you're a skilled person and a skill that people want that you could trade. And so what happens is now we've got another element in our society that makes this especially difficult. We don't have enough craftsmen in our society anymore. We've said everybody has to go to college or you're dumb, right? So that means plumbers who will always be needed, or carpenters or bricklayers. These people are in high demand and short supply. They're going to do pretty well in a barter economy. If you're a quote unquote knowledge worker and the economy's collapsing, if you work at a bank or if you're in software or things like that, there's not going to be a market for your services that you can barter any longer.
Okay, so that's pretty terrifying.
Yeah, not the most encouraging discussion.
No, well, I know if I were just watching this and not actually participating in the conversation, I think my question would be the same. Well, then, what do we do? Are you saying that we should just become preppers, or is there something that needs to take place? You know, when you hear people say in the New York Times, well, the Republicans are evil because they're trying to ask for spending cuts, and this is not the time, because it never seems to be the time to actually get spending under control.
That's very human.
Yeah. What are everyday Americans? What's our role? What can we actually do when the problem is this big?
I mean, I would start by saying non-facetiously, yeah, you should be a prepper. I mean, we don't know what's going to happen. I think our electrical grid is fragile. Our economy is fragile. The world is in a kind of chaotic state right now. So I think especially as a head of household, if you have kids, If you have a spouse that you're responsible for, you should take care of those things and make sure your house is in order, that you have food, that you have resources. I would absolutely encourage people to do that. You know, saying be a prepper, there's a way of looking at it. Oh, those are the crazy people.
And I didn't mean to
Yeah,
imply
no,
that
I know
because
you
I know
didn't
a
at
lot
all.
of people
Yeah.
are they see this as just genuinely good stewardship.
I totally agree
But
with that.
I'm just trying to think of, what do you do? Where
So
do you
phase
go?
one, yeah, absolutely be prepared. And that's not a derogatory term. If anybody takes it that way, they should just say, okay, well, I'm not a prepper, but I'm preparing my family for stuff in case stuff happens, right?
Yeah.
That's really important. Number two is we should address the problem. So if you look at Washington, D.C., every administration since Washington's administration has grown the size and scope of government. Only exception was Calvin Coolidge, and historians say he was a president who didn't do anything. He's unimportant. You know, he didn't start any new programs. He didn't build any big projects. He was getting the government's debt under control. That was his purpose. So one of the best presidents in American history. So if we know that, if we look at our history, we understand human nature. We're sinners. We desire power. We lust for money. I mean, these are normal conditions of human beings. Then if we expect Washington, D.C. to get its act in order, that's foolish. And so what we should expect is that they won't. And so the founders and the framers set up a system whereby it said, okay, one group of sinners are going to control another group of sinners. The government wasn't set up for saints. It was set up for sinners, right?
Yes.
So the group in Washington, D.C. shouldn't decide how much power they have or how much money they're allowed to spend or how long they stay in office. And so the framers set up a constitutional balance. They said, we're going to let the states ultimately decide that. So if D.C. gets out of control, the states can step in and they can put restraints on Washington, D.C. So I think today that's where we're at. We know D.C. is not going to control itself. We might have a little fight around the margins like we're having on the debt ceiling right now. You know, you were talking about the debt ceiling. It makes me laugh or cry because the big debate now is, can we do the outrageous thing of cutting all the way back to 2022 spending?
Wow.
Right. And so they're not going to get serious about it. Republicans haven't been serious about it. I was one of the people who have helped found the Tea Party. We had a fake debt ceiling fight back then as well.
Yeah.
So this is going to continue unless we do something about it from the states.
Okay. And the Convention of the States, we've talked about this a couple of times on this show. With Rick Santorum, I think we talked about it, and it seems like there might have been a couple of other people.
Probably Mike Ferris.
So it might have been Mike Ferris.
Yep.
We've talked about it, but this is really significant what you're talking about. I guess what I'm wondering is if there are, say, 50 states and 20 of them that are reliably focused on constitutional provisions, staying within your means, passing sensible laws based on values that people actually hold. If they're 20 out of the 50 and they're not the 20 most populous, is there any hope that they can actually make a difference for the rest of the country?
Yeah, so there are currently 30 states with both houses controlled by Republicans.
Okay.
That doesn't mean that they're focused on the right things, though, by the way.
Yeah.
Coming from Texas, I can tell you I was very disappointed to see a ratings chart yesterday. Texas is the 28th most conservative state in the United States of America.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, pretty humiliating for me as a Texan, but that's where we're at. We had a bad
Depends on where you
legislative...
go in Texas.
Well, it's just if you go into the legislature, that's what you're going to find.
right.
So it's not good, unfortunately. There are at least 20 states that are really seriously focused on responsible Christian things. Coincidentally, we've passed in 20 states in the Convention of States. Not all the most responsible states, though. So there are states like Wyoming and Idaho and Montana. Those are states that have not passed the Convention of States resolution yet. I would argue they are pretty fiscally responsible states, conservative states. So I think getting to the 34 mark is a doable thing. It's very hard. I mean, I don't want to undersell this. The framers intended this to be literally the most difficult thing in the American system of governance. There's nothing else in our system that requires 2/3 of states just to have a discussion.
Yeah.
It takes 34 states just to talk, right? It takes 38 states to ratify anything that comes out of that discussion. So the framers wanted it to be hard. And the reason is they didn't want us doing this willy-nilly. You know, you could imagine nowadays terrifyingly that it's like, oh, well, let's just make everybody trans constitutionally, right? And so they didn't want that to happen based on swinging societal trends. They wanted millions of people over years and years, over 34 states to decide that we wanted to talk about something. So it's a long fight. In August will be our 10th anniversary being engaged in this fight.
Okay. All right. Well, Convention of States, Citizens for Self-Governance, those are a couple of things that people can check out those. And when we do the show notes here, we'll make sure we have links to all of those things. I'd like to know what guides you, because we've actually been on some interviews that we do, like we'll show up on Newsmax and, oh, there's Mark, you know, and we get to do it together, which is kind of fun. It's always long distance. And I always wonder, man, he's always got such great things to say. How do you personally know the difference between truth and spin? Like, what are your bumpers or your guidelines that help you discern from what you're hearing and knowing what's actually true?
I mean, first and foremost for me is my North Star, which is Jesus Christ, which is, you know, the Word of God, and going to Scripture and trying to ask myself what I'm reading, what I'm seeing, what I'm hearing, what I'm saying, what I believe, does it align with the Word? That's number one for me always. Number two is my family. And so, you know, I have a wife who's been in this fight with me as long as I've been in politics. And she will call me out the second I deviate from the North Star. And, you know, that's the great thing about having a marriage partnership like that. And women see things differently. They have a different kind of discernment, contrary to what the left might tell you, right?
Yeah.
And so Patty and I have been in it together for a long time. We'll be married 30 years this August. And so I count on her. And when I'm not sure, I'll turn to her and say, I'm not sure about this, or I'm feeling weird about this. And she's always very honest with me. I'm blessed by God with two amazing kids who are now adults. And my son's a lawyer, works for America First Legal, doing great right-wing conservative litigation, super smart kid. And I go to him. You know, I'm not sure about this thing, Jacob. What do you think? And they're truthful with me. My daughter was a Hillsdale College grad, great young woman, married to a great guy from Hillsdale College, same thing. So I'll go to my family counsel.
Yeah.
I know that I'm only as good as the wise counsel that I have. So I do all that. And more broadly speaking, there are people in the media that I look to, big media figures. So people say something and I think, I don't know if that's conspiracy theory or is that real? Because you and I, we have a different responsibility. We're not just sitting around with friends over a cup of coffee, shooting the breeze, and where we can just say anything, right? If you say something, people listen.
They're going to be, yes, there could be hundreds of thousands of people listening at that moment,
right?
And millions who will hear about it if you say something crazy.
Dr. Jeff said, right? And maybe you were just kind of shooting off the cuff, right? We can do that in private, but we can't do that in front of the microphone.
Yeah.
So I listened to a guy who just got kicked off the air, Tucker Carlson, and I know Tucker personally, but I watched his show pretty regularly, and Ben Shapiro. And those are two of my North Stars in the media. And the reason I say that is these guys are true blue conservatives, in my opinion. They share my value set. And if it was true and they had researched it, and they have big research staffs, I don't, they'd be talking about it. Yeah. So I consider, like, if those guys aren't mentioning it, it might still be in the realm of conspiracy.
Interesting.
Theory. And once those guys lay it on the table for me, like, okay, they're having a serious discussion about it. Now I'm willing to go there.
Yeah, I think one thing a lot of people worry about, I certainly think about it for myself, is, am I convincing myself of something that I want to be true?
Yes.
Rather than asking if it actually is true. In other words, I'm making me the arbiter of what is actually true, rather than the discerner of what is wise based on what is true.
I completely agree with that. You know, it's interesting. We're walking over here for this interview. I had a young guy named Gabe escorting me. You know, Gabe. I would say he's wise beyond his years. And we were talking about election integrity and election fraud. And we're talking about all the things we've seen. And it seems like there's fraud. And yet at some level, you have to say, I can't say that the election was flipped by fraud. I can say I saw fraud. I see a lot of stuff that points at fraud, but I can't look at the numbers on a chart. I have not seen the proof, right? And Gabe said, so that means we can't say that the election was won by fraud, right? And I thought that was incredibly wise for a young guy to say, and I agree with that. I'm a lawyer. And so for me, it's the difference between a fact and an allegation.
Yes.
And the left makes allegations and treats them as fact. And we on the right should look at allegations and ask ourselves, is that factual or not? And I think that's what you're describing, that trap of, well, there's an allegation. I really want that to be true. It affirms my worldview, my political view. So I'm just going to run with that. And I think we have to be very cautious. And when I say we, I'm going to be broader. I'm going to talk to your audience, which is we as conservatives should be really careful about this. And you probably get this. I get a lot of people writing to me, and it's conspiracy stuff. And I don't use that derogatorily because a lot of the conspiracies have been proven to be true now. But the ones that haven't been proven to be true, I'm still going to I'm not sure about that. So, hey, if you get proof on that, let me know. I won't dismiss it, but I'm not going to go out and spread that around.
Right. A lot of my friends talk about prudence, or what is a prudential decision, which is kind of an interesting addition to the conversation, because you said the most important thing is, or one of the most important things is having wise counselors.
Yes.
Well, prudence and wisdom are the two sides of the same coin. It's a virtue that means that you don't get to control everything. You're not sovereign over all. And so if you're not sovereign over all, how do you genuinely, regularly, consistently move toward what is true for yourself and others with the humility that we don't get to just say, thus saith Jeff, and everybody in the world changes. But that's sort of how God works through time too.
Yes.
He let the Israelites be in the wilderness for 40 years.
Right.
He's very comfortable taking his time, but not doing nothing, not just sitting back. It's always movement. There's always work to be done.
Well, you mentioned my favorite word, which is humility. And so I'm a relatively new Christian, 10 years. So I was 51 when I became a Christian, became a believer, raised in a secular Jewish family, and I'm a slow learner. So my wife's always been a believer. Yeah. I'm just, the scripture says that we're stiff-necked people. So I'm particularly stiff-necked. That's right. So it took me a long time to come to belief. And one of the things that I came to admire as I hung out with Christians all around the country through politics was humility. Like, I had never seen this kind of humility. The political sphere is not filled primarily with humble people. It's quite the opposite. It's people who think they know, who think they can tell you, who think they should be running things. So in a lot of instances, it's the opposite of humility. And I had a chance to meet people like you, like Mike Ferris, like Rick Santorum. There was a pivotal event in my life. I sat at a dinner with Dr. Dobson and his wife and a bunch of, I would describe as very important people around a table at some fancy event. I didn't say a word the whole time. I felt like a little leaguer. It was ambassadors and senators, and everybody was talking about their accomplishments. And, when I met Reagan, when I was in Germany, and Dr. Dobson was sitting there, and he was pretty much controlling the conversation because everybody was deferring to him. Yeah. I knew who he was. I was not a believer at the time. And it became very obvious to me over the course of the dinner that he didn't talk about himself at all. And I knew his history. I thought, well, he's been a counselor to presidents. He started television networks. Like, this is a giant in ministry. And I realized all he was doing was refocusing everybody on whatever they had done. And it was humility. And I remember looking across the table and just thinking, I don't know what that is. Like, I don't understand that, but I want that. And so I think this idea of humility, it's the opposite of what we preach in modern America, right? It's the opposite of our athletes and our politicians and our musicians and our actors and our culture. But I actually think it's one of the most important traits in a human being if you're going to live a righteous life.
Yeah, so good. What a great thing to say. I affirm that with Dr. Dobson. When you are with him in a conversation, you feel like you're really important and that you're the center of his attention. And what a worthy example for us to follow. Mark, thanks for being on the show today.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's an honor.
Yeah. Thank you to Mark Meckler for coming on the show. Christians are called to be wise as serpents in all things, including our interactions in politics, finances, and government. Let's take seriously this call to be discerning, especially in this age of darkness. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next week. Hey, are you looking for more great podcasts that can help build your faith and give you inspiration? Our friends at Edify have what you need. You can find more podcasts, including the Dr. Jeff Show podcast, on the Edify app. You download it at edify.app or search for it in the Apple Store or the Google Play Store. Spell Edify EDIFI.